Thank you to the audience for coming. I want to thank all the organizers for doing all the work, the hard work to get us here, and I'm learning quite a bit from all of you. So my paper is Women's Anti-Fascism and the Spaces of Transcultural Activism in the Italian Diaspora. So much ink has been spilled, both real and electronic, about whether the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is a fascist, or if his use of Mussolini's phrases is haphazardly unintended or very much a part of strategy. That in and of itself, just asking that question, puts us in a transcultural and transhistorical location. While the connection the connection between Trump's fascism and Mussolini's fascism has to do with ideology, its center is about the culture of masculinity. Men in patriarchy, whatever their totalitarian or ideological stripe, tend to use mothers and children as best they can, to uphold, to romanticize, to denigrate, to twist, to turn, and even to threaten. That's not just an Italian thing. Motherhood has been on my mind for a long time as a historian. My research has made me think about particular mothers and the particularities of motherhood. I am struck about the endurance of motherhood in Italian American communities and the ways that both men and women have used it to both denigrate and combat stereotypes. My talk today is about the way women work transnationally and transculturally to aid the suffering of Mussolini's victims from Italy, mostly from Italy. I was going to include Ethiopia, but I don't have time. Motherhood was a common theme women used to challenge the regime. Sometimes this theme was subtle and sometimes not so subtle. So the bulk of my talk is focused on something called the Matteotti crisis in Italy. And again, I want to reflect on and reiterate the point that none of the activism around the Matteotti crisis would have been possible had there not been an Italian diaspora and sort of the connections between Italians and others among in communities around the world. I will show in this talk how women orchestrated challenges to the regime to bring global attention to fascist repression and atrocities. I will also show how moments of anti-fascism became connected through women's organizing. I argue that both homosocial and heterosocial spaces that women anti-fascists used and created were strategic. Women organized around particular episodes to weaken the regime and to put pressure on the international community to intervene. Women used tactics learned in earlier women's rights struggles to meet the shifts in imperial capitalism as it manifested itself in the hyper-nationalism of fascism and patriarchy in the regime. Sometimes they focused on motherhood, and sometimes they focused on humanity. So sometimes they focused, the better way to put that is, sometimes they focused on mother rights, and sometimes they focused on human rights. The rise of fascism relied on physical violence and political manipulation in Italy. It also relied on emotional violence and nationalist sentiment in the diaspora. In turn, anti-fascists used a number of strategies to contest Mussolini's onslaught on both sides of the Atlantic. And I wish I could speak more to Australia. I think it's the next phase of my research, but I don't have a whole lot of anti-fascism work in Australia. The first episode of women's international solidarity in the anti-fascist community came in 1924. In 1924, women heard about Velia Matteotti's plight for the first time. keep in mind that hearing about that again is connected to this diaspora community. In 1924, spring elections brought increased bloodshed in Italy and the Italian streets, in which fascist squadristi suppressed voter turnout around the nation. If you think about it, so it's not until 1926 that Mussolini really consolidates power. So part of my argument as a historian is about time. And so one of the things that historians are always interested is moments of possibility. So if you think about it, so 1924 is a moment of possibilities when things can turn another way. So that's important to think about and have in your head as I go through. So anti-fascists combated the black shirts in violent and non-violent ways. One of the most outspoken critics of the regime and one who invested in non-violence was someone named Giacomo Matteotti. Matteotti was the leader of the Italian Socialist Party, and in 1924 he was in his third term, serving in the Chamber of Deputies. Matteotti had done jail time during the Great War for his anti-war activities. Like many anti-fascists, Giacomo thought truth-telling would help tumble the regime. Among the truths he told were the specific ways that fascists had used violence to undermine democracy. On the 30th of May, Giacomo started his famous treatises of facts and also verbally sparred with Mussolini in the Chamber of Deputies. United Press reporter George Seldes, in his 1936 book Sawdust Caesar, recounted the exchange between Matteotti, Roberto Farinacci, Mussolini's right-hand man, and Mussolini. Matteotti was called a liar and a falsifier for naming the violence. He was shouted down and ordered to prove it. Matteotti was not just a politician, he was also a husband and a father. Velia Tita married Giacomo in 1916. She was 25, he was 31. They had 3 children, Giancarlo in 1918, Matteo in 1921, and Isabella in 1922. Unlike her husband, history has left his wife, Velia, in almost complete silence. She is one of the many women almost lost to history. Only recently have there been works on her life, and these in Italian. The most important one is Stefano Caretti's edited volume of letters between Velia and Giacomo. In January of this year, the Archivio Stato and Rovigo included a roundtable discussion on Velia for a symposium on the Roselli brothers. The Roselli brothers are also two famous anti-fascists who Mussolini later killed in the 1930s. Velia seemed to embrace being the wife of an activist and the mother of young children. The Matteotti relationship was not a relationship of ideology. For example, like other great political left-wing couples, Filippo Turati and Anna Kulsikov, for example, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, Virgilia Di Andrea and Armando Borghi were comrades in arms as well as thoughts. To exemplify, I guess, the apolitical nature of their relationship, and I say that with a grain of salt because we could deconstruct that till as they say in American English, till the cows come home. You also Velia, so just to exemplify this, Velia wrote to her husband, "It's true that I haven't given you my opinion of your ideas that you profess with such great honesty. In front of which I am unable to judge." But Velia, I think, had an impact on Giacomo. I mean, obviously, but she occasionally brought up issues of, it's not so much women's rights that she brings up, it's about the identity of being a woman. There's a point in the letters where she actually says to him, "I wish that I could be a man for a day." And so that, again, that tells us something about her standpoint. But Giacomo was not, so if Velia is not a socialist feminist, neither is her husband Giacomo. But the politician did think about ways women, particularly women as workers, were being oppressed by the regime. And he spent equal time documenting the oppression of men as well as women. For example, in his 1923 book, The Fascists Exposed, A Year of Fascist Domination, Giacomo recounted the many atrocities men and women alike faced, and even documented similar types of oppression. Giacomo and Velia had been married 8 years when he was 39 years old. He stood up before the Chamber of Deputies that May for the last time and recounted the violence of the spring elections. For speaking out, he was, on June 10th, kidnapped, beaten, killed, and his body was hacked up to pieces. Parts of his broken corpse were found 2 months later. Why is his story important? I guess it's important for many reasons, but it's important for this paper because the world watched. The world watched in 1924 because, again, this issue that 1924 is a moment of possibility, the moment that the fascist regime could fall. So in that year, in June, July, August, the body was found. The fascists scrambled. Mussolini was freaking out. Do you use that term?
Yes.
Okay. Velia came out. She entered politics reluctantly and for a very brief period. That and the cause célèbre that Matteotti's murder caused around the world was making and sort of helping her focus on the outrages of the regime. On June 12th, Velia went to Parliament and asked for help finding her husband. Again, she doesn't know he's dead. Mussolini knows he's dead. Mussolini invited her to meet with him. Again, because Mussolini hated Giacomo, right? I mean, they were almost come to arms, fight, fists in the Chamber of Deputies. But he meets with Velia. Isn't that kind of gross? Yeah. Yes, okay. But Mussolini invited Velia to meet with him. For a moment, he was afraid. He was afraid of the mother, and he was afraid of what she represented. Again, Seldis reports on the meeting. Mussolini greeted her and promises her that he'll do anything possible to find her husband alive. You may be assured, he said, that the government will do its utmost duty. We know nothing for certain, he told Velia, but there is still some hope. He might have said, still some hope for me. Fascists started badgering Velia. Anti-fascists responded. For example, there was violence in the streets in Catania when socialists tried to put up a red flag in the window of their building to honor Matteotti in the summer of 1924 and to pledge support to find him. Velia held a requiem mass and a private funeral the first week of June for family and friends. Also that summer, she went public and she met with Pope Pius. The disappearance of Matteotti was heinous, but it threw the regime into chaos and disarray. What Velia was doing was helping that happen. She was the symbol for a moment of anti-fascists, especially among women, especially among feminists, especially in the diaspora. That's important for historical reasons, because in the Matteotti murder, in Velia coming out, in the way that the world responded to it, it seemed things had changed. It seemed things could change. And maybe as an American, I'm saying this to myself. I don't think we've had this moment yet. We keep thinking we've had the moment, not to talk too much about. Okay. I resist. Okay. Again, Velia too responds to this possibility. She pushes herself to go public. She inserted herself into politics. She responded to the world, who she knew was watching her, in a way that they had watched her husband. In a letter she wrote to Filippo Turati, who is another leader of the Socialist Party, the month before Giacomo's body was found, she wrote about an overwhelming tiredness that, as she put it, that gave her no more strength but to live. But she also felt the necessity to respond to all those letters and telegrams, which is interesting, they're still coming in to her, especially the ones from afar, especially the ones from abroad. Love was her message. I need to respond with love. She did so in the memory of her husband. Velia's public persona moved out of Italy as part of the global anti-fascist fight. A year after the murder, she wrote a letter to Girolamo Valenti, the editor of New York City's La Stampa Libera, thanking him for sending her information on the one-year memorial commemorations of her husband's death and the support of the Italian and immigrant community in the United States. I am sending thanks, she said, to every worker and Italian-American citizen that gathered for the commemoration. I am sure that all the sacrifices will redeem civilization and justice. Valenti pushed Velia's story out further and moved the anti-fascist community to more possibilities. This being public was very difficult for Velia. The world watched. By the time the trial came in 1926, almost 2 years later after the murder, Velia had lost hope. She wrote another letter. This one, unlike those to Valenti and Turati, was actually meant to be public. It represented a decision of withdrawal from the public and political life she reluctantly had embraced in 1924, a retrenchment into her interiority, which she felt more comfortable with, and the part of her Giacomo had known. To the judge in the trial, she requested that she not have to go to the trial again. I ask only justice. Men have denied me justice, she wrote. I beg your excellency to spare me the agony of appearing before the court. From now on, I live lonely and distracted, for in this memory, with the sole purpose of rearing my sons, to be a mother, to be proud and fearless men after the great example of their father. I would love to know, actually, if this letter was published in The Nation and elsewhere, the New York Times, I think. I would love to know if it was published in the Australian press. My hunch is that it would also be in the Australian press. I would also love to know if there was a similar sort of Socialist Party editor, like newspapers in the Italian language, that she also wrote here. While Velia was fighting against fascism, others were as well. At different moments and at different times, it took different forms, this anti-fascism. Velia's interest into public, however, brought her plight to the attention to other women like and unlike her. These were political activists, feminists, outspoken women who had worked for suffrage and for peace during the early 20th century and World War I. One of them was Sylvia Pankhurst, who's on your far right. Pankhurst was a socialist, a labor feminist, a one-time Communist Party member. By the 1920s, she had been disowned by her suffragist mother and sister for working with the urban poor, particularly the Italian community in East London. Do I have like a minute? Okay, 1 minute. Okay, let me wrap it up. So the gist of it is that Sylvia Pankhurst moves into the public that Velia had left vacant. She also writes Valenti a letter, and in that letter she basically says, we're forming this International Women's Matteotti Committee. By the way, it needs to be just women, and you understand why that is, boy, because we're the mothers who people will listen to. The other interesting story about Sylvia, who, again, these are like these little nuggets that I've reached or found. This one from the British Library is that Sylvia had a lover, Silvio. Oh! And Silvio, she met in again in East London. He's an anarchist. He fled the country in the 1890s, but he helps the circuit. He's the transnational locator for Sylvia. He sort of pushes her out from this bourgeois umbrella of the Pankhurst family, which ends up disowning her and kicking her out of what's known as the Women's Political Union, which is a suffrage organization in England. And so all of these things come together to build an anti-fascist community that is very much embedded with transnational feminism. And there's so much more to tell. But I can't tell it. So